Okay, so now continuing on with 2.1, it's going to, in Module 2, it's separated into 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, and 2.6. So 2.1, we're going to cover the different types of tissue, epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and muscle tissue is what we're going to talk about. Now, nervous tissue is one of these four types of tissues, but we'll cover that during the nervous system talk. So continuing on with 2.1, the last PowerPoint that we saw was connective tissue, if you've watched that yet. If not, this will be the first of 2.1, and this is epithelial tissue. So like I was talking about in the other PowerPoint, there's in 2.1, we're talking about different types of body tissues, and there's four of those, okay? And we just watched the video on connective tissue, the PowerPoint, sorry, on connective tissue. This one is on epithelial tissue, which you can see is right here. And then again, obviously, we'll move on to the muscle tissue last. Nervous tissue, again, will be covered during the nervous system. We're not going to get into that right yet, but connective tissue being covered, and now we're moving on to epithelial tissue. This slide was also in the last PowerPoint, just showing you the four different categories of animal tissue and then all of their subcategories, which we're going to talk about. So on to epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is made up of sheets of cell that cover whole surfaces of the body, okay? So they form the covering or lining of all internal and external body surfaces. Epithelial tissue that lines surfaces on the interior of the body is known as endothelium. Endo meaning on the inside, right? Protects underlying tissues that may act to filter biochemical substances. So epithelial tissue is something that covers another organ to protect it. Made up of closely packed cells arranged in one or more layers. We're going to talk about those different types of layers in a second. Epithelial tissue is usually separated from the underlying tissue by a thin sheet of connective tissue, and that's called a basement membrane. So it provides structural support for the epithelium and also binds it to the neighboring structure. So that's what binds it down. Is the basement membrane. It binds it down to the underlying tissue. Each epithelial cell is attached to its neighboring cell. Remember, we talked about it's a whole bunch of cells that make up a sheet, and they're all attached to each other by junctions. And there's three different types of junctions that we're going to talk about. There's desmosomes, gap junctions, and tight junctions. So these are three different types of connections that epithelial cells are going to make with each other. They're going to kiss each other and touch each other and connect to each other. And these are the three ways that they're going to do that. So also, each epithelial cell has a different surface, okay? So we just talked about how they're connected, so the different types of junctions, but also the surface of these epithelial cells can be different, and it all depends on where they're located in the body and what their job is. So there's four different types that we're going to talk about. There's the smooth surface of the epithelial cells. There's microvilli, which is kind of like a brush border. There's cilia, and then there's keratin. Each epithelial cell, besides having different types of junctions and different types of surface linings, it's going to have different shapes. Again, the subcategories to every subcategory, right? So different shapes that these cells may have, they can be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. Okay, so all these epithelial tissues are composed of a whole bunch of epithelial cells that are connected side by side into a sheet. These cells can be a different shape, which can be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. They can be connected to each other by different types of junctions, and the surface of these cells may be different depending on what their job is. So epithelial cells may be layered or not. So remember, I keep saying that these cells are all connected to each other and make a sheet. Well, there may be multiple layers of these sheets, and they're laying on top of each other. And that kind of epithelial tissue is called striated. So again, it's just sheet on top of sheet on top of sheet of these epithelial cells. Or it could just be one single layer, which is called simple. So this right here is going to show you simple epithelial, which means that just one thin layer, okay? And these are the three different kinds of cells. Remember, each epithelial cell, there's different shapes to it. So here's what squamous would look like, here's what cuboidal would look like, and here's what columnar. I always say squamous is just flat like that. Cuboidal is in a cube, cuboidal, cube. And then columnar are like columns, okay? And this columnar actually has these little microvilli on the surface area, which we're going to talk about later on. And but then they can also be stratified, okay? So these, all three of these are just one simple layer, which can be found in the body, depending on its location, but it can also be layered, okay? And this is what this section is. And these are squamous cells, just like up here, but they're layered on top of each other. So they're stratified. And this is what cuboidal cells that are stratified looks like, okay? They're all lying on top of each other. And this is columnar. Okay, and these are the columnar ones all up in stratified form. So here's what they would look like microscopically if you're working in a histopath lab. This is stratified squamous. So if I'm talking about a stratified squamous epithelial cell, I now know that stratified means that there's many layers. It's not just one thin sheet. And I also know that squamous is in reference to its shape, okay, which is the flat kind of cells that you see up here. And if we send a chunk of epithelial tissue, and it happens to be a stratified squamous epithelial tissue, this is what the histologist is going to see under the microscope, okay? So this is the epithelial tissue here, and you can see the multiple and multiple layers, and this is actually squamous cells. And here it talks about the pseudostratified. Pseudo just means they aren't quite layered on top of each other like the typical stratified, but they're definitely not single layered, okay? So the pseudostratified columnar. So these are the columnar shaped cells, and they're pseudostratified. So they're definitely not a single layer, and you can see here it's kind of a mess. And you can see in this diagram here, you may get a better idea of what I mean by pseudostratified. It's just here it's one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. But when you look down here, they're all kind of not quite as neatly placed on top of each other, but they're definitely it's definitely more than just one layer. And you can see that here. It's all this right here is the epithelial the columnar epithelial tissue right here, and it's stratified. And then the last one here just shows you simple cuboidal. So I know what this means. If I say simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, I know that cuboidal means that they're the cube-shaped cells, and it's simple. That means that's just one simple layer of it. Okay, and this is what it would look like if we sent a chunk of that epithelial tissue, of that tissue, off. What it would look like microscopically is just one simple layer, and these are cuboidal. So epithelial tissue. There are other epithelial cells that exist that aren't necessarily descriptive of their shape. Okay, so this is, of course, just to make your life difficult. It can't be as simple as just squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. There's also transitional epithelial cells, and these are stretchy cells that are found exclusively in the bladder. Okay, so when we talk about urinalysis and when we get into lab procedures, we talked a lot about transitional cells, and these transitional cells are strictly found in the bladder, and they are a type of epithelial cell, and they're very stretchy, which allows the bladder to stretch, right? There's also glandular epithelial cells, and these again are epithelial cells, but they don't fall under squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. They're glandular, and they actually form a gland. Okay, and we're going to talk more about that later on. So let's discuss these transitional cells. Okay, so they're not squamous, they're not cuboidal, and they're not columnar. These are transitional cells that are strictly found in the bladder. Okay, so it may also be found, I keep saying strictly in the bladder, but it may also be found in the urethra, typically because they slough off from the bladder and move down. They have an amazing ability to stretch. Okay, so it allows the bladder to expand during urine collection, and then it kind of deflates once we urinate. It's amazingly leak-proof, okay, which is what we want in the bladder, obviously. So it prevents the urine from leaking into delicate environment of the abdominal cavity. And there are some certain traumatic cases with patients where there is a leakage within that bladder. For example, if they were hit by a car or something like that, and there's been a break in this leak-proof barrier, the urine is going to leak into the abdominal cavity and its surrounding tissues, and that urine just scalds, and it's very, very bad. So we really need to have that urine contained within the urinary bladder, and thanks to these transitional cells, we can do that. It has an amazing ability to change shape and layers. So the transitional cells, because it stretches, once it stretches, it kind of changes its shape. So if we talk about an empty bladder, there's about 6 layers of these transitional cells, and they happen to be round or diamond shaped, and that's what it would look like within your bladder when it's empty. Now, once a patient's bladder starts filling, these 6 layers, round diamond shaped transitional cells, are going to start stretching, right? So that 6 layers actually thins out to 3 layers, and the top cells actually become squamous looking due to the stretch. But again, once the bladder is emptied, it'll go back to the 6-layer round diamond transitional cells. This here is a glandular cell. So this is a type of epithelial cell, like I said, that's not squamous, it's not cuboidal, and it's not columnar. It is glandular. So it actually forms a gland, and you can kind of appreciate that thanks to this picture. So a gland, if we just talk about a gland itself and what is it? It's a group of cells that are able to make and discharge a secretion. And guess what kind of cell those are? Those are epithelial cells. Okay, so during embryonic development, these glandular cells, these epithelial cells, these glandular cells, form an invagination. Okay, and this invagination usually becomes the duct to the gland. But again, remember that not all glands have ducts, right? We talked about the endocrine system being the ductless gland system, so they don't have ducts leading anywhere. But there may be an invagination within these glandular cells in the developing embryo, and that usually develops into the duct of the gland. And then during development, it will turn into a gland with a duct, if it's an exocrine gland, of course, or a ductless gland if it's an endocrine gland. So amazingly enough, these glandular cells are quite special, and they do form into these glands. If you take a look at, this is exactly what we were just talking about on the other slide. A and B, these 2 pictures here, are showing you embryonic development of a glandular cell making an invagination. So this is the connective tissue underneath. Remember, we told you that underneath epithelial tissue, which is usually on the surface of something, right underneath it is connective tissue. So you can see the connective tissue here, but on top of that, we have these glandular epithelial cells. And during embryonic development, you'll actually start seeing these cells invaginate. And this is what I mean by invaginate down here. They'll kind of creep down into this invagination. And then if you take a look at C and D, during the development, it will actually turn into an endocrine or an exocrine gland. This right here shows you an exocrine gland. So it has a duct, right? So the duct is right here. So it's going to be leading out into something. Okay, and then we have an endocrine gland here. We know that endocrine glands are glands that do not have any ducts, but actually transfer their hormones through the blood system. So again, the invagination doesn't affect this one. You'll have your epithelial cells up here, but the gland down here that is made up of glandular epithelial cells. So very interesting. The exocrine glands, again, just to make your life difficult, the exocrine glands that we talked about have different shapes of ducts and glands, okay? So there's different, and each one have a different secretion style,